This is the second lecture in a three-part lecture series, which is pioneered by the Hayden lecture series, and I'm the inaugural person. Who would have thunk it when Dr. Kipp asked me to come visit with you all maybe 10 years ago, that I would show up as the Alexander Campbell professor. So the universe moves in very deliberate ways. And to my hopefully beginning friendship with the Lawsons, who we had great conversation, great laughter. So I can always tell people's being through their laughter. So thank you so much for all you've done and shuttling me around and providing for this community, these friends to gather. The name of the second lecture is called Black Liberation Theology and Global Cross-Cultural Leadership. In his pioneering book called Black Religion and the Imagination of Matter in the Atlantic World, James A. Noel makes a strategic theoretical intervention in the study of black religion, the late James Noel. Dr. Noel writes the following: I have tried to situate black religion within a broader geotemporal framework than America, and instead place it within the Atlantic world, a world comprised of Europe, the Caribbean, South America, and North America. This broader framework is not merely a matter of moving a particular subject of knowledge from one compartment to another. It entails redefining the subject of knowledge in relationship to other phenomena that appear in making such a move. We do not know what anything is until we view it in relationship with other materialities that account for its appearance, close quote. Dr. James Noel is arguing that all investigations into African American religion fall short unless these examinations intentionally link the United States domestic situation with what he calls the Black Atlantic world, meaning the historical bonding of African peoples circumscribed by the Atlantic Ocean from Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, South America, and the United States of America. Dr. Noel's insightful conceptualization brings added clarity on two levels at this particular time at the beginning of the 21st century. First, his sharp thought is a crucial reminder to reconnect black religious studies to Africa. Specifically from 1619 to 1990, enslaved Africans and blacks post-slavery have always and actively tied their domestic affairs with the international affairs in Africa. From August 1619, when the first group of 17 men and 3 African women were brought by force to Jamestown, Virginia, until Nelson Mandela was released from prison in February 1990, Black Americans have continuously linked themselves to Africa. But since Mandela's freedom, there has been an almost 20-year break in relationships. So Dr. Noel challenges us to bridge that post-1990 gap and make a vital contact with Africa once again. On a second level, Dr. Noel's insights push us to rethink black theology, to take on the global reconfigurations and opportunities brought about by the rapidly shrinking world of fast-paced global contact. So if we restate these two positions of Dr. Noel, we conclude the following. In the particularity of black theology, we need to reconnect our ties with Africa. And this claim is based on tradition. And in the generality of the larger worldwide intertwining of technologies and economies, we need a new type of black theological leader for the 21st century. This claim is based on today's international challenges. This paper this evening explores Noel's second question. What is the relationship between black liberation theology and the worldwide phenomena of close, local, and global interconnectivity? I think that today's black liberation theology must create a new type of global cross-cultural leadership because of our worldwide interconnectivity between the local and the international. This is what I take Noel to mean when he writes, quote, "This broader framework that I'm advocating is not merely a matter of moving a particular subject of knowledge from one compartment to another. It entails redefining the subject of knowledge in relationship to other phenomena that appear in making such a move, close quote. In other words, Black theology has to redefine the nature of its ministry in relationship to global phenomena that appear in front of us right now. So here's my thesis. It's good academic. Black liberation theology has to include practical ministry along with its prophetic and priestly ministries. Prophetic ministry demands a counterattack on unjust structures. Priestly ministry requires those trained in healing. But practical ministry looks at the local and international connections and works on enhancing a leadership who will construct a new society through governing wealth and people. That's my thesis, and here are my presuppositions. We keep the prophetic dimension of speaking truth to bad structures of power, and we keep the priestly aspect of healing the emotional and physical hurts caused by unjust structures of power. Yet at the same time, at the start of the 21st century, we need to focus more on a practical ministry, which for me means nurturing a new type of global cross-cultural leadership. And here's the implication. If we don't expand our ministries to international possibilities, Black liberation theology will fall behind the opportunities that global cross-cultural relationships can offer young people in poor and working class communities. We will become trapped in a vicious cycle of mostly reacting to bad systems and not using the majority of our energy thinking about how to link practically to the new global situation so that poor and working class Blacks have access to and enjoy all of God's creation. That means working with those living in the urban areas and the rural areas throughout the United States to own their own businesses and create their own jobs. From its beginning, Black theology rightly claimed service to the Black poor and working people, and indeed all oppressed families, communities of all racial and ethnic backgrounds. And this is the epitome of liberation. But unfortunately, rather than enjoying access to earth, air, and water, the essentials for having a full life promised by God to all human beings, working people today of all colors and ethnicities are riding an acute wave downward statistically and materially. Therefore, as a reorientation forward, this presentation looks at the relation between Black liberation theology and global cross-cultural leadership. And so my thoughts, my discussion unfolds around two parts. The first analysis explores what type of leadership that the founding generation of Black liberation theology developed in the 1950s and 1960s, and what were the conditions in society that impacted the leadership of this first generation. And then the second part of our discussion then correlates 21st century conditions and how these changing contexts demand broadening the type of leadership needed for Black liberation theology today. So to sum up, the first generation of Black liberation theology was forced to wage a culture of protest. And as a result, the Black theology activities of the founding generation began as a leadership of prophetic necessity. In contrast, the beginning of the 21st century daily worldwide interconnectivity now requires expanding Black liberation theology activities into global cross-cultural leadership. In contrast, the 1960 society and theology had to marshal a Herculean amount of energy to deconstruct rigid, exclusive political and economic structures in society and rigid theological and religious systems in higher education. Now, while maintaining the prophetic and priestly ministries, we must expand to a practical leadership, one that governs the material necessities of life, owning earth, air, and water, and one that governs the political policies, managing institutions, impacting working class and poor families. But before expounding on these needs for today, we first explore the conditions and context of black theology's first generation during the middle of the 20th century. The 1950s efforts by Negro Americans to exercise their constitutional rights as U.S. citizens, and the 1960s call for black consciousness and black power to share in the material benefits of America drove many black pastors in 1966 to create contemporary black liberation theology. On the side of the civil rights movement, numerous factors spurred on the iconic Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. For example, we discover at least these two background contexts. One, the open casket funeral of the deformed body of Emmett Till. And two, the international experience gained by Negro GIs who had served abroad in World War II and in the Korean War. Many of you remember or have read about Emmett Till was a 14-year-old Negro boy from the south side of Chicago, sent to spend the summer with his uncle in Money, Mississippi. Following a dare of his local Mississippi cousins, Till went into a grocery store and upon leaving said, "Bye, baby," to the white female cashier, who happened to be the wife of the owner. Till was later kidnapped at gunpoint by the husband and his brother. On August 28, 1955, they beat Till's body so terribly that his uncle could only identify the little boy by a ring on his finger. Till's mother insisted that Till's Chicago funeral have an open casket, and Jet magazine carried that grotesque picture of the disfigured dead Till to almost every black home in America. Such a brutal outrage helped spur Negro impatience with the legal system of white power at that time. In a similar fashion, Negro soldiers returning from military tours of duty abroad injected invigorating energy into Negro expectations. To travel the world, interact with others as normal people in foreign lands, to don the uniform of one's country and in certain instances wield weapons of war in defense of one's own nation, catalyzed a large segment of Negro GIs to return to the United States and forbid any persons or situations from blocking them to execute their civil rights and their God-given rights as human beings. So consequently, when Rosa Parks, a Christian, began the civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama on December 1st, 1955, 4 months after the Emmett Till lynching, not only was the local Negro Montgomery population ready, indeed, nationwide Negro communities had already been primed for the over-the-top sadistic Emmett Till murder and the enthusiastic determination of many Negro GIs returning home. And just 11 years later, in 1966, the youth and student wing of the civil rights struggle combined various intuitions and therefore crafted what we call the Black Power movement. Their common sense wisdom wondered why they had to allow their physical bodies to be damaged and killed by legal and illegal structures of white power. They felt duped by what they call liberals on the federal level promising citizenship and the American dream, but instead allowing the amount of Negro bodies and the wounded to pile up at the hands of legal white policemen and illegal paramilitary groups. In contrast, the youth, impatient, and student wing of the civil rights movement sensed potential allies in the national liberation movements occurring in Africa, Asia, and South America. And so in the 1950s and the 1960s, served as a watershed whirlwind in the ongoing American experiment, our experiment, to realize democracy for all its citizens. Now, for the black pastors who initiated black liberation theology in 1966, God had offered a kairos, an opening in the second half of the 20th century, a divine window of grace and opportunity. And so these pastors felt called by God to respond as the extension of biblical prophets from Jeremiah and Amos in the Old Testament to the historical Jesus of the New Testament. These pastors forged a black liberation theology of prophetic ministry, speaking truth to structures of asymmetrical American power. And these pastors participated in the priestly ministry, healing the wounds of many African Americans across America. So in this respect, we can frame the founding generation of Black liberation theology as one of prophetic and priestly ministry. So now we want to expand prophetic and priestly ministries to include 21st century global cross-cultural leadership, which means developing ways of governing resources and institutions in people's daily lives. For me, the key is ownership of and access to wealth, as we mentioned, earth, air, and water. How can a global cross-cultural leadership of wealth accumulation and policy administration assist Black working class and poor in inner cities and rural areas to own their own businesses, create jobs, manage where they live, and provide a future for their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren? How do we expand prophetic and priestly to practical ministries? Such a leadership development of linking inner cities and rural areas with the international situation has direct impact on how people see themselves as agents in history on earth. And it directly impacts tithes and offerings for Black churches. It impacts the reality of gang activities, the illegal industries, and how some police see Black bodies, and the tax base required to improve streets and sidewalks and alleys and bridges in the so-called American ghettos. Specifically, it includes preparing teenagers to govern globally and locally, or else we stunt the future leadership of Black America, as well as the United States and the entire world. It entails preparing our children and our young people for governing material, human, and institutional resources in an intercultural earth neighborhood. It consists of equipping our youth to lead the fourth industrial revolution. These dynamics of nurture will enable our young people to accumulate capital and manage communities for social responsibility to help the needy. Clearly, with manufacturing jobs abandoning many inner cities, our youth require training and retraining in information technologies, finance, service industries, and new manufacturing, all of which are now globally intertwined. Are we even aware of virtual reality, augmented reality, smartphones, robotics, 3D printing, and the Internet of Things? How does global finance operate in the inner cities? What is the future of manufacturing, and how do inner cities fit within such strategic plans? Where are the ecological sustainability industries in the urban and rural areas? And how does technology help to integrate all the systems required to make cities livable and rural agricultural viable? What possibilities present themselves for Black urban and rural America and Africa to conduct educational exchanges and trade deals? And where is Jesus in all of this? To relish and respond to these emerging theological challenges today, Black liberation theology now pivots to practical ministry, reconnecting the local with the international to govern earth, air, water, and people. Several reasons justify why Black liberation theology today requires intimate involvement in global cross-cultural leadership as a form of practical ministry in the 21st century. First, Black theology, since its founding, had already integrated its constructive theological statements with what it called the Third World. From its start, the first generation of Black theologians eagerly sought out the All-Africa Conference of Churches and held joint meetings on the African continent. Then James H. Cone connected United States Black liberation theology to the yearly meetings of the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians, the only worldwide organization comprised of all first-generation liberation theologians from Africa, Asia, Caribbean, Pacific Islands, and South America. At the same time, Black Theology Liberation USA and Black Liberation Theology from South Africa conducted bilateral meetings and conferences. So there is already a tradition amongst the Black theologians. Second, Jesus addresses ownership of wealth, governing people and resources, and technology and enabling freedom. Specifically, when we view Luke chapter 4, verses 1 through 13, Jesus undergoes three forms of temptation. And in my theological imagination, and many black preachers' imagination is all imagination, but it's theologically based because the Bible says. And in my theological imagination, I interpret these temptations in the following way. Jesus refuses the first temptation to turn stone into bread, which can signify wealth because it necessitates earth, air, and water to produce bread. And he refuses the second temptation to rule over all the kingdoms of the world, which can signify policy management of resources and people. And then he refuses the third temptation to fly into the air and rely on the techniques of the angels to aid him. And so we could claim that Jesus avoided and denied wealth, first temptation, rulership, second temptation, and technology for freedom, third temptation. But actually, he refuses these opportunities, in my view, not because they exist as bad things in and of themselves. Rather, Jesus refuses to accept these offers because they provide gifts for his own individual, personal benefit, and because the Satan character represents concentrated negative energy or extreme individualistic spirit. In fact, the evidence of this interpretation surfaces in Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 20, where Jesus proclaims the primary reason why he came to earth, that is to liberate the poor and the oppressed, to proclaim good news to the poor. And this itself means a promise of a new life on earth and beyond. To proclaim freedom for the prisoner means providing the needed material necessities so poor and working people won't go back to jail. Recovery of sight for the blind tells us we need both spiritual and physical sight to remove ourselves from unjust structures. And to set the oppressed free means the abolition of that which causes unfreedom. Jesus came to earth for this primary purpose. And so to fulfill his vocation, Jesus also will work with people to enjoy an abundant life for themselves and their families. This remains a major contribution to all the world's religions and spiritualities and self-cultivation practices. That is, the poor, the prisoner, the blind, and the oppressed all over the world, because of Jesus, can have ultimate hope in life. Third reason why we need to turn to black theology connected to an international situation is that the Bible, as we mentioned in Luke chapter 4, 113, and the tradition of the first generation of black liberation theologians, they support my idea. But also, if we need to deal with the international situation, we need to forge a specific global cross-cultural leadership, which I also call common sense logic, which my father often used a great deal. And then fourth and finally, why do we need to link black liberation theology in the 21st century to an international situation? My own experience teaches black liberation theology to create a practical ministry defined by global cross-cultural leadership. For example, I initiated and managed a 14-country network called the International Association of Black Religions and Spiritualities. This network consisted of Hawaii, Fiji, Australia, Japan, India, South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Ghana, Cuba, Jamaica, Brazil, England, and the United States. The programmatic thrust of the network focused on exchanging youth and students from different countries around the world. It became clear to me as I travel around the world that the future leadership of those 14 countries resided in those young people eager to envision their own global cross-cultural leadership. Indeed, where such a yearning and creativity and practical implementation took place, we discovered pockets of energy and innovation in already local global connections. As I traveled globally, those 4 countries and 30 other countries, visiting and living there, I experienced a comparative lesson in intercultural and cross-cultural hope for planet Earth. Despite the particularities of various cultures, I discovered all peoples wanted the same thing: stable families, education and future for their children, productive jobs, access to technology, healthy local communities, sustainable ecologies, world friendship and peace, and a vibrant faith and spirituality. But what impeded successful, productive international relations was low cultural intelligence about other countries' cultural values. To be harmonious neighbors on planet Earth means, for me at minimum, learning about other cultures of other nations. Learning about other cultures and other nations. So where have we been so far? Well, along the way, in our conversation, we noticed the factors giving rise to the 1960s Black liberation theology, stress on prophetic and priestly ministries. We then turned to different factors calling Black liberation theology to practical ministry, that is, 21st century global cross-cultural leadership. Black liberation theology, as we said, keeps prophetic ministry, demands a counterattack against unjust structures. Black liberation theology keeps priestly ministry, which requires those trained in healing. But now we want to explore practical ministry and looking at the local international connections to nurture a leadership that will construct a new society through governing wealth and people. If we can agree or be open to that Black liberation theology needs to move in the direction of global cross-cultural leadership, what might it look like? What is it that we need in order to carry out the Jesus story of spreading bread, rulership, and technological freedom to the least in our inner cities and rural areas while stretching forth our hands in solidarity internationally? I think actually building global cross-cultural leadership helps Black liberation theology catch up with two things. For example, first, today's world is instantly bridging cultures and peoples and putting them in contact literally every second. For example, now the ability of digital technology to compress time and space has enabled everyone in the world to experience events and people in real time. Everyone in the world with the appropriate technology can see any event in the world simultaneously. Likewise, digital technologies such as WeChat and Skype can put into immediate conversation together, live and in color, at the same time, on the same conversation, a person in Chicago, in Dalian, Kauai, Accra, Bangalore, London, Rio, Havana, and Dubai, in an ongoing video conversation call. Some of us have already done that. The spirit of the time is one of interconnecting planet Earth. In fact, systems are already connected now. Many churches broadcast live services to world audiences. And even inner city youth have cell phones, which can become smartphones wired into international knowledge. So there's already interconnectivity. So Black liberation theology has to catch up. Second reason, Black liberation theology has to catch up with where Jesus is today. Learning from the 1960s Black theology first generation question of where was Jesus in the civil rights and Black consciousness movements, we too can ask a similar question for today. Where is Jesus in the immediate, split-second world interconnectivity? If Jesus already exists in these instantaneous international dynamics, because Jesus already exists, this is an affirmation of faith, then we are called to follow him on this path. So, for the remainder of our discussion, I'd like for us to look at three ways of moving along this path of local, international connectivity for Black liberation theology, and others who are interested. The first step for Black liberation theology to consider on the path to global cross-cultural leadership is to help working class and poor families to focus on knowing oneself. Knowing oneself. Specifically here, we draw on lessons from Bill George, who's known for his research and writing on leadership of national and international organizations. Bill George describes 5 dimensions of authentic leadership as knowing oneself. understanding our purpose, practicing solid values, leading with our heart, establishing a long-term relationship, and have personal self-discipline. He elaborates, we understand our purpose by becoming more intentional about the passion driving what we do. In fact, how many of us take time to think about the passions we had growing up and the passions we hunger for today? Now, as a theologian, I see one's vocation emerging out of the connection of passion and purpose. God has called us for a purpose, and God has given us a passion to witness to that purpose. So purpose clarified by passion then is followed by the second point of Bill George. He calls our values. Under pressure, what values do we practice in the crucible of adversities or temptation? When I use my values to make a decision, would I be comfortable if these values and decisions appeared on the front page of my local newspaper? As a theologian, I translate this to mean, what Christian non-negotiables are my anchors in times of storms? Next, after values, in purpose and passion, we encounter leading with our hearts, which includes expressing compassion for others. It seems to me one of the clearest criterion in the Jesus story is the unleashing of the human capacity to have empathy for someone who has fallen on emotional and material hard times. Compassion consists of both prayer for the spiritual well-being of each person and assisting the person with the material resources so she or he can control her or his own material well-being. Compassion also emphasizes each of us having compassion for our own selves, especially when we have made mistakes or done wrong. In fact, the key to success, I think, is going through and learning from many failures. And so self-compassion is to recognize that we are all still children of God, and is also to maintain hope of eventually achieving our goals despite or through our failures. We extend our hearts to ourselves by affirming our sacred creation and our wisdom from lessons found in leadership development. In other words, after the deep darkness of the many midnight hours of our efforts, joy and success will eventually come in the morning. Now, if I was in my local Southside church, the organ would start playing, but that's all right. No, I don't want to go there. I'm a wheelbarrow preacher, so I might. The fourth aspect of knowing oneself points to an orientation of nurturing long-term friendships. Leaders are people who share their stories and remain open to hear the stories of our local and our global neighbors. This dynamic enables the process of building long-term friendships instead of using people for short-term gain. Long-term friendships suggest we see people as human beings first. We actually look at the many neighbors across the earth as bearing the imago Dei underneath their different political and ideological and cultural and economic outer clothing. And fifth and finally, authentic leaders of the 21st century practice self-discipline. Self-discipline includes exercise and sleeping and eating healthily, and the importance of daily meditation and prayer and deep faith in God. For Black liberation theology, this stands as the plumb line for knowing oneself. After knowing oneself, the second major category for implementing global cross-cultural leadership for poor and working peoples is knowing the culture of one's own home country. Cross-cultural leadership tells each person to bring her or his knowledge, appreciation, and love of one's own home culture to the global conversation and the exchange of ideas. For example, when we talk about knowing the culture of the United States, two of the many subcultures constituting the United States of America show themselves in the Western European heritage and the Black American folk tales. We're going to talk about Brer Rabbit tomorrow night. We could make a strong argument that the best of the Western European values in the United States culture are compassion from ancient Israel, individual rights from ancient Greece, representative government from ancient Rome, and hope from the origin of the Jesus story in Christianity. Similarly, we could say that the Black American folk tales offer 4 cultural values. Nature, the value of nature, which comes from the conjurer figure. All this will be elaborated tomorrow. Reversal with the trickster character. Ambiguity with the outlaw character. And liberation for the poor with the Christian representative. Knowing one's own culture basically answers the question, what foundational values make our country unique in the world? Since Black liberation theology is made up of at least 2 cultural traditions, African and American, it needs to embrace a profound self-understanding of both its Western American and its African American parts. Accepting both parts will allow Black theology to become even more self-confident as it builds friendships with other cultures and peoples and religions around the world. The third and final major category for implementing global cross-cultural leadership is knowing the culture of at least one foreign country. The scholarly research on facilitating global cross-cultural interconnectivity helps us here at this point. The purpose of this literature is to teach us how to approach other cultures. What general framework do we use to identify the unique cultures of different nations? And within this research, and there's lots of research, Andy Molinsky, who his name comes up a lot, Molinsky presents the worldview and practice of what he calls global dexterity. He writes, quote, global dexterity is about learning to adapt your behavior across cultures. No matter what culture you come from, what culture you're going to, or the situation you find yourself in, so that you are effective and appropriate in that setting without feeling that you are losing yourself in the process. Adapting behavior across cultures, end quote. His adapting behavior model tells us how to read and practice cultural codes in a new country or a new cultural situation. Molinsky claims that all countries and all groups of people have a 6-dimensional framework, which is the definition of global dexterity. These 6 dimensions define how members of that country or culture operate. They are 1, directness. How straightforwardly am I expected to communicate in this situation? Directness. 2, enthusiasm. In this culture, how much positive emotion and energy am I expected to show to others in this situation? 3, formality. How much deference and respect am I expected to demonstrate in this situation? Assertiveness. How strongly am I expected to express my voice in this situation? Self-promotion. How positively am I expected to speak about my own skills and accomplishments in this situation? And lastly, personal disclosure. Personal disclosure. How much can I reveal about myself in this situation? And different cultures and countries all work within this framework, but they're on a continuum. For example, hopefully in the question and answer period, I can give my experience of 14 countries, that network. They all spoke English, but my main job was translating 14 types of English to all the different people. Some people showed up 2 hours after the start of the meeting. Some people showed up 15 minutes before. Regarding knowing other cultures, some scholars introduced the idea of living into what they describe as CQ, or cultural intelligence. For Christopher Early, and these are some of the leaders in the literature, cultural intelligence, or CQ, entails 3 parts: the cognitive part, the motivational part, and behavior skills. The cognitive includes knowledge of self, social environments, and information handling. The motivational includes one's internal drive toward and curiosity about diverse cultures. And behavioral means having the skills to put into practice our knowledge and desire. Also, David Livermore describes drive and knowledge and strategy and action as the 4 parts of cultural intelligence, or CQ, which are needed for global cross-cultural interconnectivity. His contribution is to lift up CQ before knowledge, and so we have to have interest and confidence and drive to adapt cross-culturally. In addition, in her book, The Culture Map by Erin Meyer, offers another model which explains how different cultures communicate, how they evaluate, persuade, how do they lead, how do they decide, how do they trust, how do they disagree, and how do they schedule time. And finally, when we look at the Tropinars, and these are really the heavyweights, these 2 guys. They draw on their empirical and theoretical studies of global cross-cultural work for the last quarter of a century, a period in which they conducted 1,500 cross-cultural training programs in over 25 countries. And they shrink all their conclusions down to the following observations about the basic characteristics that all cultures have. All countries are concerned about relationships with people, attitudes toward time, and attitudes with regard to the environment. So going to a new country, that 3-part framework can help us. How does this country see people? How do they see time? And how do they look at the environment? They believe that all countries show this. So what is the point? I point here simply to give examples of the rich and diverse literature on the subject of building global cross-cultural leadership through knowledge of oneself, knowledge of one's own country, and knowledge of at least one foreign culture. So I want to leave time for discussion since we ran out of time last week, so I have truncated. And I won't do the Baptist now that I'm concluding. I'm really concluding. Let us conclude our discussion. We have used the method of correlating for 2 ideas. First, what conditions in the 1960s gave rise to Black liberation theology's leadership? That context resulted in prophetic and priestly ministries. Second, what are the contemporary factors in the 21st century that challenge Black liberation theology's ministry today? And we were saying circumstances today require us to maintain priestly and prophetic ministries, while we now expand practical ministry into global cross-cultural leadership. And along the way of our discussion, we drew on the Christian tradition of Black theology. We looked at the biblical stories of Jesus. We expressed some common sense logic, and we did a social analysis of the present moment to draw our conclusions. If Black liberation theology still follows Jesus' liberation, and many of us who are theologians still think and believe in Jesus, but I put the if in to allow people in some room to wiggle. If Black liberation theology still follows Jesus' liberation, which is anchored in the poor and the oppressed, then that global cross-cultural leadership has to link the local urban and rural areas with Black, poor, and working people, with the rapidly interconnectivity of the world. And then we ended our journey, our conversation. We concluded our conversation with some theoretical and practical models from leadership of the development literature on 21st century intercultural research. So remember, we began this presentation with James A. Noel's pioneering book called Black Religion and the Imagination of Matter in the Atlantic World. And in Noel's language, if you recall, what we're trying to do is we're pushing to redefine, as he called, the subject of knowledge, redefining that subject of knowledge in relationship to other phenomena that appear in making such a change, close quote. And so we redefined the subject of Black liberation theology to expand into practical ministry because of the phenomena of the 21st century in making such a move, paraphrasing Noel. From a healthy materiality of matter, where poor and working people and their families have agency, we can imagine their new form of leadership, one defining a practice of ministry where they govern their own wealth and they govern people in their own communities and even the world. However, to pursue such a path of wealth and governance, Black liberation theology works with these families and communities to link their local eyes to the international horizons. And as a final example, and it really is a final example, let me share some of my own work in this area. For almost 20 years, I've been part of a men's ministry on the south side of Chicago. Some of what we've found is the following. Many of those young black teenage boys and young adult men are already caught up in the connection between the local and the global. The increased black male unemployment is directly connected to manufacturing jobs going abroad. And in a similar way, one could make a strong case that the drugs and illegal guns flooding the South Side have international ties. In addition, brothers and sisters who are immigrants from other countries own quite a number of small shops in these inner city areas. Even the building of jails and maintenance of prisons are too often linked to private companies operating on a world scale. Disproportionately, black and brown teenage boys and young men occupy these profitable incarceration businesses. And even in sports, many of these inner city males follow their favorite American football and basketball teams that are more and more playing exhibition games in Europe and Africa. Relatedly, they watch particular black athletes in the Olympics all over the world. And even concerning the prices of the goods in which these black males spend their money, pricing is linked to international factors such as Brexit, the dynamics in China and India, sovereign bankruptcy of Greece, the underdevelopment of Africa, and other processes. And these teenagers and young men are already plugged into or have the potential to get involved in the global. Specifically, although many might not have computers at home, still many have cell phones which can be converted into smartphones, and thus allowing them to have instantaneous connections to each of the 194 nations in the world. Part of lifting their eyes from the local to the global and back again consists of exposing them to other possibilities beyond their current space and time, and simultaneously helping them to gain wealth and jobs in order to stabilize their lives. A prophetic church ministry encourages them to speak truth to unjust such structures so that the powerful will eventually move away from their wayward path and back to a path of sharing God's creation with all people. And a priestly church ministry enables them to appreciate the harmony and balance of life energy inside of each breath internal to their bodies. So that as unjust structures become more democratized, they can move into leadership positions based on the harmony and balance of their breathing inside of their bodies. And with prophetic ministry changing external structures and priestly ministry changing the calmness of their spirit inside their bodies, practical church ministry means working with these teens and young adults to govern wealth and people for a healthy society and healthy individuals in society. Actually, Black Liberation Theology works with the church, and together they both remain on the path of the Jesus story of the Bible and the journey of liberation and practice of freedom for poor and working people, locally and throughout the world. And while building on this tradition, Black Liberation Theology has to increase its focus on developing global cross-cultural leadership. And I believe this is good for all humanity at home and abroad. Thank you.